All right, so today we're going to finish our lecture on the evolutionary trends in the synapsid reptiles, and we're going to get through a bit of the classification and natural histories of the reptiles. That'll probably trickle over into Friday, and Friday, if we look at our lecture schedule, if we go down. All right, so right now what we have here is reptiles of Pennsylvania and the amniotic egg. So the amniotic egg lecture is fairly short, and I am assigning you guys the reptiles of Pennsylvania, which is basically, if we go into our materials by week, you will see in our week 7 folder, what we have is we have a reptile learn list, and just like always, we have our reptile learn list PowerPoint. So each one of you is going to pick 3 species from 3 different families. It's the same thing we've been doing with other animal groups. Okay, so do make sure you have that done for Friday, and that way when we get through the natural history of the reptiles, and we'll see what our schedule is like for the amniotic egg. Because I know on Friday it's really important that we end on time, since many of us have to run to manatees. All right. So last time we talked about some of the general trends in the synapsid reptiles. So we're kind of looking at the group of reptiles that eventually led to the mammals. And in general, what we saw is how being a nocturnal animal, basically the first mammal-like reptiles that eventually radiated and became the mammals, the only niche that was available to them was the nocturnal niche, because a lot of the dinosaurs were heliotherms at the time. And in order to support their high levels of activity, they started to consume insects, which were at the time becoming much more common and radiating out in their diversity. And we talked about how jaw structure has changed from the more primitive reptile condition, and this evolved so that they could actually chew their food. Do you guys remember why chewing food is actually helpful to digestion? Why was that? Yeah. Faster release of nutrients, increasing the surface area for those enzymes to act upon the food. We talked about homodonty to heterodonty, so having the same peg-like teeth and making those teeth more modified over time into different tooth types. And we looked at the cat in lab yesterday. We saw how the cat had incisors for clipping, canines for piercing and biting. They had a specialized type of premolar known as a carnassial, and those carnassials are for the shearing of meat, and then they have one tiny molar. So more herbivorous animals are going to have a lot more molars for grinding. So being able to chew the food, get more nutrients out of it more quickly, is going to allow them to have the energy necessary to support endothermy, to keep themselves warm in their nocturnal environment. We just looked at a few different types of skulls there. And we talked about diphyodonty, how heterodonts over time started to develop this 2 teeth sets, basically. So the milk teeth that the babies have, and then they lose those milk teeth to get their adult teeth. I think, did we end at, no, we talked about more than lactation. So selective pressures there are, again, especially endothermy, but also mastication. And our secondary palate is important because it allows us to chew and breathe and eat at the same time. And we saw how the jaw joint changed, how originally we have the articulation point in reptiles is the articular and quadrate, but in mammals it's the dentary and squamosal, and how actually some of the reptilian jaw joint is now in the middle ear of the mammals. So having more of those middle ear bones is going to allow them more sensitivity to what's happening in their nocturnal environment. And I think we ended here looking at the rotation of the limbs under the body in the mammals, allowing for greater speed and greater agility. So agility meaning they can change directions and really do a lot of things that the reptiles cannot. All right, so the last thing we have to talk about is fur. So fur is one of those things that was actually observed in the fossil record. So we do see it as a fuzz around the skeletons, and its primary use was insulation. So if you're a nocturnal mammal, it's colder at night, so fur would reduce the amount of heat loss. And we know that therapsids had them because of the imprints in the fossilized soil of fur. And the selective pressure here was nocturnality. So it was nighttime. In order to stay warm, they had their fur. So we're looking at one of these therapsids right here. So it still looks rather reptilian, right? But it started to develop fur, and then we have this really furry kitty right there. But another really important evolutionary trend involved the brain. In particular, a specific place in the brain or an area known as the neopallium. And this is observed by looking at the skull structure in fossilized remains. So this is a new area that mammals have and reptiles do not. And in the therapsids, that's when this enlargement began. So what the function of it is to be able to integrate sensory information from your nose to your ears. This is something that the reptiles could not do. And the reason for this is you're living in a dark environment, right? So mammals needed to be able to have a way to integrate those different senses and use them more as a functional unit. So this is not at all for the eyes. So the part of the brain that was involved with sight was already well developed. This new part of the brain was basically selected for based on nocturnality to allow those animals to integrate all this information that they're getting from their ears and their nose. So when you're walking around in the dark, you need to have a 3D understanding of where you're walking, right? And not only for moving around, but seeking prey and avoiding predation. So if you've ever tried to maybe chase a mammal in the dark, especially one that has very good eyesight in the dark, they're very hard to get. And that's because they're able to process the light in the environment in different ways, or they have a very good memory. So when the light goes out, how do you guys do about walking around in the dark? Like if you're in a new place, right, that could be an issue. But let's say the lights go out at your house and you know where you basically got stuck. You can kind of walk around and bump into things, but you do have that three-dimensional memory of your environment. So this is something that we take for granted. And this has allowed complex behavioral responses. So this new area of the brain allowed more complex mental processes to occur. And we can actually see the different parts of the brain. This is an embryonic brain, and this is an adult brain. You can see the neopallium as this outer layer, the archipallium for old, right? And the paleopallium for even older. So these are the older parts of the brain. Neopallium literally means the newer part of the brain. All right, so just to summarize, why did mammals happen? It's because of dinosaurs. So dinosaurs made these therapsids into the mammals that we know today. So forced them into a nocturnal niche to eat insects, basically. And they had a higher rate of food acquisition, so they were able to catch more food. They were able to do this partially because they were more agile. They could catch more things. But they also had very high rates of food processing. So they developed different types of teeth to eat different food items. They had 2 tooth sets. Because remember, part of the reason that babies don't have teeth is to allow for suckling to occur a lot easier. So maybe some of you have heard your mothers talk about breastfeeding and how when you got teeth, that's when she pretty much stopped breastfeeding. Anyone's mom talk about that? Yeah, some. Yes, no. Well, my sister, when she fed my nephew, he got his teeth in really early, and she said that it was like trying to feed an alligator, so she had to stop that. But you can make a better seal when you don't have teeth. So that is where Diethyodonti came from, and that's linked to lactation, which is a really huge investment of parental care. The secondary palate is necessary not only for chewing and breathing at the same time, but in order to suckle for extended periods of time, to be able to suckle and swallow and breathe at the same time. The zygomatic arch and enlarged dentary, this allows more complex muscle attachment and larger muscles, especially the zygomatic arch. So this allows for more biting strength, and this new jaw joint, the dentary squamosal, allows for not just up and down movement, but side to side movement. So truly chewing your food. And then nocturnal activity. In order to live in the dark, you need to have more complex hearing apparatus. So they have that with the 3 middle ear ossicles, the incus malleus and stapes. The neopallium, the new structure of the brain that allows the integration between hearing and smell and allows complex behaviors, having fur and evolving a controller, so for temperature regulation. So partially our hypothalamus, right, which helps us to control our internal temperature and tells us when we should shiver and when we should sweat. So this is kind of a story of where we came from and how these different complexities that we see in the mammalian condition arose from something like the reptiles, that some of them are still running around. All right, so let's move on and talk about the different types of reptiles. Where is it? All right, so let's talk about the different reptile groups. So notice in this particular cladogram, the turtles are found here within the diapsids. All right, so subclass Diapsida, but recall that they do have an anapsid skull structure. So this classification, not everybody agrees with it, but that's where our book is classifying them. Okay, so do make sure that you understand that. And we can see the different skull conditions. Okay, again, this is the classification that you need to know. Anything with a plus sign next to it is extinct. And as you can see, the majority of the taxonomy or the taxonomic groups of reptiles are now extinct. Let's talk about the living reptiles, because we already talked about the extinct ones. And let's look at order Testudines in our subclass Diapsida. So our turtles and our tortoises. So turtles, if it's an aquatic Testudines, and a tortoise if it's a land Testudines. There's about 250 species. We find them in tropical and temperate waters, and pretty much they're everywhere. I mean, there are tortoises in the desert, and there are marine turtles, and there are freshwater turtles. So they're about 225 million years old. So they're from the Triassic, and many of them look very primitive because they are old. They do have a shell that is composed of a carapace. So the top of the shell here is a carapace. The bottom is a plastron. And these scutes that are forming on the outside of the shell, like the little shell plates, they call them scutes, those are epidermal bones, and the inner layer is a dermal bone. Okay, another interesting thing about them is that they don't have teeth. That's why sometimes when we watch a tortoise eat, they might look like an old man gumming their food down. I mean, to me, that's what they look like. But they do have a keratinized beak, and some of them have very hardcore keratinized beaks. So some of you may be familiar with snapping turtles, like this guy here. I actually used to take care of a number of snapping turtles. One of them, he was named Frumpy, and he was the mascot of the USS Pasadena, and he was brought to Cal State Pomona on a helicopter from the U.S. Navy. So he was kind of like our special celebrity turtle. So the lab closed down, so I have to figure out what happened to Frumpy, because he was a special gift, basically. But we also had a very large turtle. He's the largest turtle known to live in captivity. He's now at the Six Flags Turtle Farm. He's an alligator snapper, and his name was the General. That's what we called him. And my very first day ever working in the vivarium by myself without my boss and my coworkers there, I came in, and he snapped his head at the glass and shattered the aquarium that he was living in, and hauled himself out and basically walked around snapping at stuff, and snapped a broom in half when I was trying to basically push him back in the room. And so I was in some state of shock, and I had to call my boss at home, and I was just like, the General's out. And he's like, well, he won't, dehydrate or anything. I can come later and we'll take care of it. But that particular snapper was really, really scary. Like, he could really cause damage. And I do have a video of one of the alligator snappers. So again, this reduced shell here, you can see about the extent that he can pull his head back in. They can't pull it all the way back in because by reducing that shell size, they can move around much faster and change directions. All right, a little bit more about their anatomy. So you can tell the difference between terrestrial and aquatic forms by shell shape. So when you look at an aquatic form, you generally tend to have a low, streamlined shell, but in a terrestrial form, you have much higher domed shells.
Some of the big guys there, and they had like damaged shells, and they were literally held together with duct tape.
Oh.
My God.
So Jade was just telling us about how there were damaged turtles at, where was it again?
We were in South Carolina.
Yeah, in South Carolina, and they were holding them together with duct tape. That's pretty bad. Yeah, it's really difficult for them if you injure their shells, because if you think back to the lab yesterday and you look at that turtle shell over there, if you break the top of that shell, what are you breaking? You're breaking a spine, right? So if you do see turtles or tortoises in an area that's safe for you to get out, if they're trying to cross the road, it's nice to help them, but be very careful. And in some cases, there are tortoises that are endangered. In the Mojave Desert, the desert tortoise is endangered, and I almost got fined $10,000 because I was on Interstate 15, and there were two of them crossing the highway. And I could not really live with myself if I didn't do something about it, so I pulled over and I moved them, and there was a game warden there. And, I was like, I realized that it is illegal to touch them, so I was like, do what you got to do. And the guy's like, well, in this case, you were really trying to help them, so I'm just going to turn the other way. But there are a lot of endangered animals that you should not touch. And another example of this is the leatherback, which we see right here. So this is the very largest turtle there is. It's marine. It's about 2 meters long. It's very heavy, and they are extremely endangered, but they are beautiful animals. What they're doing here is they're putting a GPS transmitter on this turtle. They can put smaller ones on now, but you have to hope that the glue is going to hold. Plus, those turtles do shed their scutes. They shed their shells, so you lose them after a short period of time. And when I was doing a field biology class down in Baja California, we stayed at El Campo Arquelon, which is the sea turtle camp, and the guy who ran it let us live there, basically. It was actually a cool place to live, and we got to work with the sea turtles, and we got to put on transmitters and stuff. So we did get to touch a leatherback and a green sea turtle and a loggerhead, but we were covered by his permits. And I will tell you, they've got these big eyes, and they have absolutely no aggressive bones in their body. So it's no surprise that they're endangered because they're a big animal, lots of meat on them, easy to hunt. And the Pope had declared them to be fish, not the current Pope, okay? one of the older popes said that they were fish because they were in the ocean, and people, the Catholics can only eat fish on Fridays, so that also contributed to their endangerment. So, well-meaning, but not always the best thing. Okay, a little bit more about them. So these guys run the gambit for how they eat. So they're carnivores, herbivores, omnivores. The box turtles that you guys might keep as pets, they're omnivores, so you can feed them a lot of different things. And they do have very elaborate courtships. So, and they can actually have mating calls. So their mating calls can actually be quite loud, as you can see. And they also have elaborate pheromones that they can release, so the female can release those when she's ovulating and receptive for mating. And they do have internal fertilization. They have a copulatory organ. And they develop within an amniotic egg. So these guys are oviparous, so most of their shells are leathery, and they do have some calcium carbonate in them. So the stiffness of the shell depends on the species. And usually they bury a hole, or they dig a hole and they bury the eggs in the hole, and they just walk away. So this is one of those species that there's no parental care whatsoever. And you've probably all seen the sea turtle hatches, but they're so cute. So we're going to watch a sea turtle hatch.
Where they show them getting eaten.
Oh yeah, like the Discovery videos where they show these guys get eaten is very sad, but that's reality. Yeah, Katie.
So is it easier for the first ones to hatch, or is it harder for the first one to hatch to escape the burrows?
That's a really good question. I would think that if you're on the top and you hatch and you get out, it would be easier. But if you're the first out, somebody could be waiting to eat you. So I think as a baby sea turtle, there's really no good place to be born.
Maybe the middle.
Maybe the middle?
I'm thinking like the first ones would get eaten,
Mhm.
and then you can get out, and then the last ones are struggling for too long.
Yeah, maybe you have to get out when all the predators' mouths are full.
Now I know with crocodiles, they'll
Mhm.
do like the genders of the. I'm not sure if this is an unconscious decision
Uh-huh.
by alligators, if it just happens to be this way, where like one gender will be at the top
Mhm.
and receive more heat, the other gender will be at the bottom. Is that the same with turtles?
Yes, so a lot of reptiles, their genders are determined by the temperature of their incubation. So males tend to result from slightly warmer incubations, and there is, in addition to the theory that the dinosaurs, it's actually a very well established theory that at the KT boundary, the large asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula. But there's another discussion that as a result of that lowering of the temperature of the Earth in general, that there may have been a feminization that happened with a lot of the reptiles. Like maybe the majority of the reptiles that were born were female, and there were not enough males to propagate the species. So there's a lot of different extinction hypotheses that people have come up with, and I thought that one was particularly interesting. All right, speaking of alligators and other crocodilians, we're moving on to superorder Archosauria, and birds are actually archosaurs. So we are talking about the non-avian reptiles in this lecture. So there's only about 21 species, and we tend to find them in subtropical and tropical habitats. So they don't do well in temperate places because they don't handle snow that well. There was a famous alligator in San Pedro Bay in California. Did anyone ever hear about Reggie? He's still there. The crocodile hunter was supposed to come and help catch him, but he died shortly before he was going to come out. So it was really sad, but yeah.
I think they found it in the Susquehanna.
They found one in the Susquehanna?
Yeah, it was somebody's pet.
Yeah, actually, and you guys might think this is crazy, but alligators are actually pretty cute, and they can make good pets. You just have to avoid the sharp end. Because I did raise an alligator from a hatchling until she was 4.5 feet long, and her name was Fluffy. And I loved her very much, so I really missed her when we had to send her somewhere else where she wouldn't potentially hurt someone, or where she had more room to run around. So yeah, Shay.
Isn't there a problem with people like from non-native habitats getting them as pets and then releasing them?
Oh yeah, just like anything. When you get a pet and it's not supposed to be in an environment, you release it, it's going to have all kinds of unintended consequences. Which, makes a lot of interesting things for people to study, but can be catastrophic to the biodiversity of different areas. So in general, we separate them into these two groups: the alligators that live in freshwater, and then the crocodiles that live in a combination of freshwater and marine environments. They're old. They've been around since the Triassic, and they haven't changed that much, but their earlier fossils, they had much longer hind limbs, and this is because they came from the bipedal thecodonts. So that was kind of a leftover trait because those thecodonts were bipedal. And the very largest one is a saltwater croc of the Indo-Pacific, and so they've eaten at least 10 people in recent years. So there's man-eaters out there. Just don't mess with them. In general, alligators are less aggressive than crocodiles. So they are carnivores. They eat fish, mammals, and birds. If they have long, narrow snouts, they are evolved to catch fish, just like the gar that we looked at earlier on, how they have those thin, needle-like beaks to catch the fish with. Mammal eaters are shorter and broad-snouted. But if you see a crocodile and it has a long, thin snout, don't mess with it, because it'll be perfectly fine eating you. As far as their anatomy, they're quadrupedal, so they run around on all fours, and they have this laterally compressed tail, so it's kind of thin and tall to help them swim, and they are very good swimmers. They do have a tympanum, so they have a tympanic membrane that's covered with a scaly flap so they can hear. And they have nostrils at the tip of their snout, and they can open and close those nostrils with a sphincter muscle. And because it's at the very top of their snout, they can breathe by exposing very little of their head, so you can't see them. They do have a secondary palate, so this is an advance for them, and it's similar to what we saw in the advanced therapsid. That means that they can drown their prey, so they can hold a prey item in their mouth under the water, and they can have their nose sticking out of the top of the water, so while they're drowning their prey, they can still breathe. Bad for the prey, but good for them. They do have a 4-chambered heart, and they're the only living reptiles that has this. The other living reptiles have 3-chambered hearts, very much like the amphibians that we looked at. As far as their courtships, they do have very loud mating calls. They drum. They have pronounced territories, and the males do have an unpaired intromittent organ. When we look at some of the other reptiles like the snakes and the lizards, they actually have something known as a hemipene, which literally means half penis that they can use independent of one another. So they have 2 of them basically. And my hypothesis was that the male herpetologists were jealous that they had 2 instead of 1, but that's just me, so they called it a half. But they do mate in the water, and they do have an amniotic egg, and it's a very heavy calcium carbonate shell. They produce lots of eggs, and they make a debris nest. And basically by the debris breaking down, kind of like if you're composting, how the compost pile will produce heat, they basically bury their eggs in a compost pile that keeps them nice and warm. But the interesting thing about them is that there is parental care. So the mama alligator actually puts a lot of time investment into her young. She may even help them out of their shell. She may carry them to her rearing site, and the female American alligator can stay with her young for 2 years. I mean, really, there's few things cuter than a baby alligator. So if you've never had a chance to play with one or see one, they do make those little noises, and they're absolutely adorable. So I think we're out of time today. So for Friday, please work on your reptile list. So get those slides together and we'll finish this lecture, go through your reptiles of Pennsylvania, and I will be posting the amniotic egg so that we can do that lecture too on Friday, and then you'll have some questions to do over the break that reviews the last 2 lectures basically. Okay? So I'll see you guys on Friday.